Sara has a fascinating background. She spent 14 years at Whirlpool Corporation, working across innovation, design, user research, and quality, where she received intensive training in lean thinking, which has actually changed how she views work. So she's applied these principles at Bose and now at ServiceNow, and she's going to be talking to us today about how we can explore lean thinking, how it can help us eliminate waste and maximize value in user research operations. We're also going to discuss a particularly timely question. How does AI fit into all of this? Sarah wrote a piece for the Great Question blog on this topic. So we'll be sure to pop that into a link into the chat and share it out afterwards as an additional resource. But before we dive in, if we haven't yet met, I'm Tara. I'm a senior user researcher here at Great Question. Great Question is an all-in-one user research platform that makes it easy to do everything from recruiting the right people, whether customers or non-customers, run all the methods from interviews to surveys or prototype tests, and share what you learn with your team, helping companies like Brex, Amazon, Intuit, and many more. We also have some members, some Great Question members on our team that are going to be in this session. We've got Mary, Lucas, and Laura. They work with research teams every day and they love talking about this stuff. So you can feel free to connect with them in the Zoom chat as well. And be sure to just drop your questions in the Q&A in the chat at any time. We'll weave them in as we go. And then we're also going to hold some time at the end to answer some questions. So, Sara, welcome. You have such a unique background. Most user researchers haven't spent years in a quality organization at a manufacturing company where you've had the opportunity to take part in some intensive lean training. So, can you paint a picture for us of what that was like? You described it as transformational and humbling. What made it so impactful?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned, I started my career at Whirlpool, and I spent 5 years in their quality organization, which gave me the opportunity to take their lean experience course, which was a 1 week intensive offsite course. I think the book was about yay big. But it really went through the principles and the rules of lean thinking, and especially how it applies to non-manufacturing situations. I think a lot of people think of lean, they think of manufacturing. And so to be able to see those principles in action in business processes was really helpful. And to me, I think it was one of the most transformational and humbling, as you mentioned, trainings because it changed how I see work. And it also changed how I see the value that I bring to my work and how I'm serving kind of my customers, both directly and indirectly. In lean, there's kind of this crystal clear definition that's the center of it is around value and waste. And value is what your customer is willing to pay for, and waste is generally everything else. And when I applied that definition, when I looked through that lens to my work in quality, I realized the entire quality organization was essentially waste. We existed as an organization to fix problems that if things had been designed right, engineered right, manufactured right, shipped right in the first place, our organization wouldn't actually exist. And it wasn't because we weren't working hard or delivering good outputs. It's just that we were catching problems that shouldn't have existed in the first place.
Mhm.
So with that, I had to kind of step back and swallow my pride and think about, well, what can I do with this? And fortunately, this training gave me tools to change things. It gave me tools to think about my own work and my own team, but also more broadly, how can we think about our customers, the value that we're providing, and how can we do those in ways that really reduces as much waste as possible. And ultimately, this kind of got me back to UX research. As I think about the value that I bring, I really wanted to be in a position where I saw myself delivering value, not just trying to minimize waste. And so got into innovation and then ultimately back to research to be part of that kind of front end value creation.
So that's so interesting. I already have a million questions for you, but maybe we'll take a step back and let's talk about the basics. So when you say lean thinking, what exactly do you mean? What is it? What isn't it? And so on.
Yeah, great place to start. There is a lot of confusion around this term. Sometimes you say lean and people suddenly think job cuts. I'm going to lose my
Mhm.
job because they're leaning out an organization. And lean thinking is not about staff reductions. It's not about doing more with less. I want to be really clear about that. It's also not things like lean startup or lean UX, though those areas also borrow a lot from lean thinking. But true lean thinking actually comes from Toyota in the 1950s. And it was a mindset, a systematic approach that they brought to manufacturing practices. And like I said before, at its core, it's really about how do you maximize customer value and how do you minimize the waste? And the key word here is it's systematic. It's not one-off kind of disconnected activities, but it's how do you think about the work that you do holistically? How do you think about it end to end? How do you think about it with all of the people and processes that are involved in work? And really looking through all of that with the lens of like, is this adding value or not? I do want to acknowledge the like research ops professionals that we have on this call, because I think like the best research ops work is fundamentally lean. Whether you have the vocabulary for it, whether you even knew that you were doing lean, you're working to eliminate unnecessary variation. You're working to prevent downstream problems. You're thinking about how do we become more efficient and more effective in our role in our organization, and you're creating systems that scale. And all of those are characteristics of an organization that has embraced and really is living lean thinking.
That's interesting. And so, how would you define value and waste in the context of user research or research operations?
Yeah, absolutely. So in lean, value is always defined from the customer. And by customers, I really mean anyone. So it's really obvious to think about our end customers. If we're producing goods or services, whoever that individual or organization is who's paying us for what we're delivering. But a customer really is anyone who receives the output of your work. So that might be the person who's downstream from you in a process and you're providing them information or they're waiting on a decision from you. Could be your stakeholders where they're making decisions or taking actions based on data or insights that you're providing. It's really any individual, even yourself. If you think about yourself coming back and revisiting information in the future, it's really any individual who downstream from you is going to be consuming outputs of your work, whatever that might be. And so, for something to be valuable, three things need to be true. First, the customer needs to recognize it and is willing to spend their resources, whether that's money or buying a product, could be their time, their attention. Are they willing to spend their valuable resources on whatever it is that you're producing? If so, that's value. Second, it needs to alter the output, which means me being in the room, being part of, a meeting. If I don't fundamentally alter the output of that meeting, if a decision isn't different, if the output isn't different, my presence there didn't necessarily add value. So we need to think about how are we actually impacting the results of the work that we're doing. It actually has to change because of it. And third, and this is really what kind of ties back to the quality example, is that it needs to be error-free and done right the first time. If it takes you multiple attempts to kind of fix something or get to value, you're adding waste in the pursuit of that. Um, and so when we think about waste, again, it's kind of the opposite, but it's tricky because it masquerades as good work. I mean, a lot of us kind of pat ourselves on the back. We pride ourselves on, this exhaustive report. It's really rigorous, it's detailed, it's flawless in terms of its design and execution. But if nobody reads it, if no one's valuing the content that's in it, it's waste, unfortunately. It's kind of a harsh term, but that's the reality. It's similar if you're, doing a lot of interviews in research and you're on your 15th interview, but you reach saturation of insights back at interview 8. And it's like, yes, your sample size is larger, but are you really delivering more value with each incremental interview? And the answer is probably no. And so waste usually creeps in when we're unclear about who our customers are, or more importantly, we're unclear about what they actually do and don't value. either because they've never told us or because we haven't bothered to ask.
Yeah, and I think there's a question in the chat. And you might get into this a bit in the slides that you'll be walking us through, but yeah, I think there's an interesting question around how do you distinguish between what's necessary rigor in research and in the process, and what is just waste. And you think you gave some examples, but I'm curious if you could speak to that a bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. And so again, I think it comes down to really understanding who your customer or customers are. And
Mm.
so some of us maybe don't think of our stakeholders as customers, or we don't think of our peers, the researchers, as customers. But being really frank and honest about what do they need, what do they want, what are they actually going to be able to take action on. And so we might think that we are delivering value because it is rigorous, because it is, like I said, polished. It's that beautiful deck. But ultimately, if we actually ask the question about, but what do they need to do their work? What do they need in order to make a decision? What do they need in order to then deliver to their downstream customers? We might be maybe a little bit more honest with ourselves and say, yeah, it's a beautiful, rigorous report, but is it necessary? And could we have had the same value? Could we have had the same impact with maybe something that was half the size? Or maybe not a report at all, but a 5 minute stand up or an in person conversation. And so, again, it's humbling because a lot of us kind of stake our own value in these deliverables. And I think as researchers, we're very familiar with what those deliverables are. But we have to question, is it necessary for our customers to actually move forward and do the things that they need to do? And is it something that they're willing to pay for in terms of their time and attention?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And yeah, I think the next thing you walk us through these seven types of waste might help clarify that even more. Something you're sort of speaking to is that there could be waste at the consumption side of insights, right? So,
Yeah.
that's one part of it. I think though what you're also saying is that doesn't necessarily mean that you aren't rigorous in research all the time, but probably you'll speak to that a bit more in this, talking us through these seven kinds of waste.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So we're going to go through the seven types of waste. They're kind of in a different order, though. If you ever want to remember this, there's a nice little acronym of Tim Wood. If you think of like someone's name, that's the seven types and the beginning letters of each. But we're going to start at the top with overproduction because it's probably the most common. And this is really generating more than what you need or producing sooner than what you need. Prior to kind of the digital age, this might have been like printing out your discussion guides and having 15 copies of them, or producing them 2 weeks before you started your interview, only to then make changes to it and have to reprint them over again. In the digital world, it could be, as I mentioned before, you're doing 15 interviews where maybe you only need 8, or you are creating a huge appendix where maybe you didn't need all of that, or it could have kind of waited until the right time to do that level of analysis rather than doing it all ahead of time and maybe trying to anticipate questions before they were even asked.
Mm.
The second one is waiting. Again, this is the one that is probably the most painful. We all see this in our work. This is things like waiting for participant recruitment. That participant just hasn't signed up. They haven't, responded to your request. Could be waiting for decisions. It could be, all sorts of things where you're waiting for someone to take action. There's an example here also of like tool credit limits halting your research. You have to wait for someone to go in and replenish the credits or make sure that your wallet is full. Well, that prevents you from moving forward. And so that delay might halt you from adding value and doing the things that you need to do as a researcher. The third one that we have here is transportation. And so there's another one further down, motion. I'll differentiate between the two of them because they are really similar in a lot of ways. But transportation is the unnecessary move of data or documents or people. So this is things like moving data between tools. You collect it in maybe a survey platform, but then you download it and put it into Excel and you manipulate it there. And then perhaps you export it again somewhere else. Well, each one of those movements is potentially transportation waste. You're moving information around. It could also be things like emailing things back and forth, updating it and then sending it again, versus if you were working in a shared document, you wouldn't need to take those steps. So thinking about where are you moving things that maybe you don't need to be moving them. Mm-hmm. Over processing is doing more than what's required or value. And this is also that, creating the polished decks when, maybe a quick readout would suffice. The difference between this and overproduction, they're very related, but, overproduction is really more about producing more, and overprocessing is like handling it more, going in there and, spending too much time or fussing perhaps more than you need to, touching it more than you need to. The next one is inventory, which is pretty self-explanatory. It's storing too much, but it's also dealing with the carrying cost of storing that and maintaining the stock. In our world, often that's data. So having repositories with a lot of data, recordings, transcripts, particularly if they're unorganized, they're hard to search. You're spending time trying to wade through the inventory of what you have. But it also could be things like keeping all of the draft versions. I know I'm, sometimes responsible for this as well, but keeping all sorts of drafts when you finish the final version. And so you have to think about what's the cost of holding on to all of that? And is there actually any value in doing that? And if not, ask yourself why and get rid of it and move on. The next one is motion. And I mentioned this is similar to transportation, but this is actually physical motion. So you think about you as an individual, if you're jumping between different applications, at ServiceNow, we refer to this as swivel chairing because you're literally like moving your chair to go between, maybe it's your research platform and Excel, it's your survey platform, it's your document, it's your PowerPoint. Every time you're moving between things, you're cutting and pasting, it's manual, activity. And so anytime that there's too much movement, too much activity, a lot of manual workflows, you're going to see that surface as a kind of waste. The other example that we have here in motion, which is probably familiar to all of us, is creating new documents from scratch rather than either leveraging your existing work or building off of a template, because the motion that you put in there to actually do the typing or the thinking through what that structure should be, you could be kind of jumping off from a point that's already structured, already thought through, and get right into adding new value versus starting from a blank sheet of paper. The last one that I have here is defects. These are errors, and they are things that fail to meet the customer expectations. In the context of research, we think about like flawed methodologies, bias sampling, incorrect data that you might have, or maybe the wrong analysis on the data. But ultimately, those are things that either are going to cause you rework, you have to go back and fix it, or it leads to inaccurate findings, which is probably the worst thing that we could do, because that not only doesn't deliver value, but might actually harm our customer in some way.
As you're talking, one of the things I thought about, and I'm not sure if this is motion or transportation, but when insights don't live where decisions are being made, if they're, like if they live somewhere else, if they're stored somewhere else, right, you do have that, like that waste, right? Like you have to know to go find it, or you have to already know that information, or you're going into a different application or something like that. I'm curious, like, are there any one of these that seem more common in user research operations?
Yeah, I would say that, waiting and over processing. Waiting, I think, is universal. All of us experience waiting somewhere in our processes, waiting for someone to get back to us, waiting for a decision to be made, waiting for a participant to actually respond to a request to be part of a study. All of those are kind of universally frustrating. But over processing is probably the most insidious. Like that's the one where, it's painful and it hides behind the guise of quality and thoroughness. I mentioned this a little bit before of like it masquerades as good work because, we think that by putting more effort, spending more time, finessing, sweating the details, we think we're adding value. That's what we've probably been appreciated for a lot. We've been, given the kudos and the pat on the back and the thank yous for doing those things. Um, but it's those multiple review cycles or having to, present your findings in 3 different formats and creating those highly polished, maybe it's the prototypes that you're using. But ultimately, if it's not necessary, you're over processing. And so again, it's about really understanding what your stakeholders are going to do with that information, what your customers are going to do with the outputs of your work. And if they just need to know, should we build feature A or feature B? Maybe they don't need a 40-page deck for that. They need a 1-page POV that says, here's the decision you should make, and here's the top 3 pieces of evidence that support that decision. And if they want to go further, then you either produce at that point or you're able to go in and put the effort in at that point to do the work rather than trying to do everything up front and then finding out that it's not actually valuable.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I know there's a number of questions in the chat. I did
Yeah.
want to ask one thing of you before we do that. I'm curious about the thoughts on over processing and um, at some point, like maybe initially, you don't need to do that big report, but like, th 3 months in the future, someone's asking the same questions again, and they're asking a layer deeper than, like decisions are not on a feature. And you're like, you know what, great, here's this report that we did that went really deep. And now, you have that document to go off of. So I'm just curious if you have thoughts on like, especially for insights, right? Like,
So
um, yeah, how do you know if you won't at a later date, right? Like need more context, need more detail or something like that.
it is such a hard balance to strike. I think a lot of us have learned to be prepared or maybe even over prepared because in the past we've had those questions or we've said, we know the stakeholder, they tend to come back a week afterwards and ask all of these follow-up questions. We're just going to go put the work in now and get ahead of that. And it almost conditions us to be operating constantly in a state of um, over processing, overproduction, trying to be proactive. Where if we really looked at it, how often is that actually needed? If it's needed the majority of the time, then that's value because that stakeholder clearly wants that level of detail. They may not want it at the exact moment that they're getting that initial POV. They might want it that week later. So they need to kind of marinate and digest what you're saying and then come back with their questions. But clearly, if they're asking for it, if they're doing things with it, it is value. Great.
Mhm.
Plan for that. But I think if we step back and said, well, rather than putting in the time and the effort and overproducing now, what can we put in place that facilitates a really rapid response to those questions? And so that might be organizing where your data lives, tagging it appropriately, not over tagging it. Again, that's kind of over processing. But how can you make it easy to facilitate those follow-up requests if they're not consistent, if you can't anticipate them, or if you don't know whether or not they're going to be valuable?
Such a good response. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I know we are going to get to sort of the like practical strategies of how to eliminate waste. So we'll get to that soon, but I'll just pause and address some of the questions that we have going on in the chat. It's a question from Susie. Just want another quick clarification, the difference between transportation and motion, one more time.
Yeah, great. They are so closely linked. The key thing here is that motion is the movement of a human or a machine. So my actual physical swivel chairing, going back between my screens or opening up an application and moving between different applications, the copying and the pasting, whatever that may mean, my body is in motion. Similarly, if I was causing a machine to do more work, that would also be motion. Whereas transportation is more about the movement of the object. So transportation is the data is having to move between things.
Mm.
They are so closely related because often when you're transporting, you also have movement or motion waste in there as well. And I wouldn't sweat the difference between them. I think it's more important to recognize they're both examples of waste. And so, how do we see those in our work, and what can we do to potentially minimize or eliminate those?
Right. Yeah. Thank you. And then a question from Laura. Have you seen resistance from teams who equate more process with more credibility? And how do you handle that?
So, I think we're going to get to this a little bit later. Process is not a bad thing. In fact, process is one of kind of the key tenets of lean is structure every activity. And
Mm.
so we'll get into like what that means in terms of structuring every activity, but process in and of itself is potentially a really good thing.
Mm.
I think where people get tripped up is if that process has waste kind of codified within it. And so you want your processes to be lean. You want your processes to focus on delivering value. Um, but process in and of itself is potentially like a very good thing because it does give us a standard of what good looks like. It helps us to know when we're maybe deviating from what that best practice is and where we might be introducing waste because of those deviations.
I love that. Yeah. And I think this is a really good point sort of to dive more into these practical strategies for eliminating waste. I do see some questions in the chat that are around waste. But let's go ahead and start talking about that from your perspective in more detail, and then we
Yeah,
can get to some of those other questions.
absolutely.
So, okay. When you're working with a team, trying to help them identify waste, where do you start? Like, what's the first go-to thing, and why do you go there?
Yeah, I mentioned this before, but I would start with who are your customers and what do they value? Because the waste usually stems because you don't have a clear definition of one or both of those questions. Um, the good thing is that as researchers, we have the tools to ask those questions. We're good at interviewing, we're good at observing, we're good at collecting data. And so we kind of want to apply our research superpowers to that question. Because once we know who our customers are, we can then observe the processes that we have. Again, process is not bad. Process can actually be very good, but we want to look at our processes objectively and really observe them like a researcher would observe a participant, almost doing a contextual inquiry. But look at like, what are you actually doing? Track where you spend your time, track how long it takes, track where the handoffs happen or where the reloops happen. You may even want to map it visually so that you can see your process kind of diagrammed out and then reviewing that to say, at every point in this process, is this something that my customer cares about? Does this contribute to the value that I want to deliver for them? Um, and you'll be surprised. A lot of times the answer is no. And again, I
Mm.
think that's where the humbling part comes in because you have to kind of admit maybe there are things that I do that aren't actually appreciated. They're not actually valued. Maybe they're not even used. And so to step back and be really honest about, if it doesn't add value or if you're not sure it adds value, those are flags to investigate further and either change the process or go ask those questions of your stakeholders, of your customers. I think you value this, but how do you actually use this? What
Mm.
decisions does it inform? How does your downstream process from there change because of this? And is there something that I could be doing better or different that would be more valuable to you in the way that I work?
So it sounds like essentially what you're saying is be a researcher, go to your stakeholders, understand what kinds of decisions do they need to make, what data essentially do they need from you, or support do they need from you to help make those decisions, or like what it is that they need to do, and sort of evaluate, get their perception, and then maybe do some self-analysis around like, am I meeting these needs? Where am I lacking? Does my process support it? Could I, and then looking at your own process and seeing where you're spending the most time. Is that where you should be spending it, given what your stakeholders actually need from you?
Yeah, absolutely.
So our team here at Great Question talks to reops leaders a lot, and waste management does come up really often. And so I know there's someone on our team here, Lucas, who wanted to give an example of someone that he's talked to, been on a call with, and what that looks like. So I'll let Lucas hop in and share that.
Sure. Thanks, Tara. One thing that we hear constantly is tied to this conversation is that research leaders' waste rarely shows up as like one big obvious problem. It kind of shows up as friction, like extra steps, workarounds, a sense that research should be easier than it is. So an example of one of my customers, it's an enterprise whiteboarding SaaS company. You can probably guess who they are. When their research lead joined, the issue wasn't necessarily like a lack of tools. It was a lack of structure. They had like all of the tools in a legacy platform. So recruitment lived in one place, synthesis lived in another, unmoderated testing lived somewhere else. So nothing individually was broken, but collectively created a lot of hidden waste and tech debt. So researchers, some of the comments that are coming up in the chat, researchers we're waiting on other teams just to recruit participants or build prototypes as an example. So there was really an over-processing of just the sheer amount of data, moving recordings and notes between tools, and there was also like constant context switching as well. They tried to, as an example, democratize research so designers can run their own studies, but the core research team became the bottleneck as well. So again, all the resources were there, but there was not this level of like connectivity. So um, they actually started to like reframe this and like what here isn't actually adding value. And so by consolidating their workflow into a single like purpose-built research platform, great question in this case, they eliminated like entire categories of waste. So like fewer handoffs, fewer tools, less manual synthesis, and far less time spent supporting non-researchers, as an example. So the mindset shift, designing research operations around like value and not necessarily like activity is what makes like this whole lean thinking conversation so powerful. And it's really a great foundation for the conversation that we're having here as well. So we just find that there's a ton of value of having like the repository on the same platform as like the participant recruitment. So all that context is still there.
Yeah, it brought up the example earlier of like emailing a file back and forth versus like having a shared document. And it's the same thing with a repository. If your stakeholders can get in there and see the analysis, they can see the videos for themselves, they can get to the transcripts. It saves you the time from having to curate that for them, particularly if a lot of those questions might be like very quick self-serve things. But to your point, it's distracting or pulling researchers away and creating that context switching, which is just an example of motion waste and having to re-onboard to a task every time you're switching around.
Sarah, I wonder if you can walk us through a few of the most impactful strategies to minimize waste once you've done this identification
Yeah.
practice.
Um, so we mentioned like process and structuring. I would say absolutely structure the things you do repeatedly. So there should be one clear process to follow. Things like discussion guides, recruiting screeners, report formats, to the extent that you can have templates or at least a jumping off point so that you're not starting from scratch every single time. And that those templates can also help guide your thinking. For example, if it has certain sections in it, you're not going to forget to include those. You'll have it as part of your consideration. If everyone's figuring it on their own or creating them from scratch, it's just an example of motion waste, but then also you drive a lot of inconsistencies. And so your level of quality across an organization or even within yourself from one study to the next might be very different because you're not starting from the same point. I would also say automate and centralize. This is a great follow up to what Lucas was just saying about like to the extent that you can get everything into the same place, you reduce the waste of moving things around, moving them between software, moving them between tools. An example that I have from Great Question, one of the things that I actually love the most and has become kind of a game changer in my work is the Zoom integrations. Because I used to spend a lot of time if I was recording a session and then I'd have to wait for Zoom to give me the email that would tell me my videos are ready. I'd have to get into Zoom, go through maybe the 6 or 8 different options that are provided between the audio only and the 4 types of video and a transcript. download the ones I wanted to my hard drive, and then upload them to a SharePoint, only then to need to download them somewhere else in order to analyze it. Versus when I go into Great Question, as soon as the session's over, the video's there, the transcript's loading, there's an AI analysis, and I've just saved myself all of this like tedious, non-value added work of just trying to get the data into the right tool, versus having it just kind of automatically appear there for me. So huge time saver. Kind of building off some of the things I've said before, I would also encourage to right size your deliverables. And so think about like, what's the minimum viable report? What's the minimum viable output that actually drives the right action or drives the right decision? And that might be a 30 slide deck in certain cases, particularly if you have like really high risk decisions where you need that evidence, you need the confidence in what you're doing. But a lot of times it might just be a 15-minute debrief. It might be that one-page POV executive summary. And so really understanding what does each situation need, what does each customer need, and making sure that you're not delivering way more than what's actually going to be useful. Fourth, I would say invest in quality up front. So that's good scoping, clear methodology, pilot testing, catch the issues early so that you can fix them so that they don't repeat through all of your later sessions. Definitely helps with, defects, helps you from having to do expensive rework, maybe even having to redo sessions because you realized you had the wrong people in the interview. Well, that's part of, kind of fixing things up front and making sure that you're not falling victim to maybe some of the biases that might creep up with poor recruiting, as an example. And finally, I'd say, keep things simple, keep your methods simple. Don't try to make things more complex than necessary. Try to find the quickest, most straightforward approach, unless, of course, the circumstances really demand that more rigor. And, if it is higher risk, maybe you do put in more time because it's warranted. But if it's low risk, what can you deliver that's going to address that without adding all of this waste to the process?
I one of the first things you called out was noticing the things that you do repeatedly and creating systems, templates, automating. It's funny because I noticed myself earlier today making adjustments to something that I know I do often, and I had a thought of like, oh my gosh, I really just need to like have a streamlined template for this. And initially I felt friction. Like I was like, great, when am I going to find the time to, set aside that work? And I think this is motivating for me. And like I sometimes notice these flags as I'm doing things. And then I need that push to be like, yes, it is important to set aside that time to do this, because it will save you time in the future. But it's like overcoming that friction in the moment, I feel like, where you almost need to convince yourself that it is worth the effort and worth the time. But I did notice there was a question from Christine a bit earlier around this. And so they were wondering, it seems that some of these things are more in our control, like, the templates and things like that, than others. So, and her example is she's not sure, or they're not sure what to do when they're waiting. Is what can you do if there are things outside of your control, particularly in that aspect?
No, it's a great question. Not everything is going to be in our control. But to the extent that you can set expectations, sometimes the waiting is because the person on the other end doesn't know that you have a deadline, or they don't know what's the right route to get you the information or how they should even structure the information. And so to the extent that you can put in guardrails and guidelines that might minimize that waiting, could be as simple as in a participant recruitment, we need you to respond by X date. Or if you're talking to a stakeholder, please email back the following 3 things. Anything that you can do that provides kind of that structure, that guidance, that takes out some of the questioning that might happen, or maybe helps to eliminate some of the spinning that they might have on their end, helps them get to a decision faster, is going to help you get the answers that you need faster or help get that action done. There's also waiting that happens, like waiting for prototypes. Again, it comes back to, but did you specify the right level of fidelity? If you were clear that, hey, I just need a wireframe for this, you probably get it faster than if they're producing something that might be like a pixel perfect prototype. not realizing that there's maybe a misalignment in terms of expectations. So in this case, clarity is kindness. The more clear you can be about when you need something, why you need it, what good looks like, what you're expecting from them, how they're supposed to respond back. All of those are things that often will have a positive effect on weighting, even if you're not necessarily the one in control of what's driving that weight.
And earlier you hinted at the importance of structuring every activity. And just to dive into that a little bit more, can you take us through this a bit and give a concrete example of what this looks like in practice?
Sure. So structuring every activity really has four components to it. The first one is outcome. So define, what does good look like? What does done look like? And so in the case of like a research, this might be good is a list of 5 to 7 key themes, each with supporting evidence, and it's documented in our template. That helps you know, okay, I'm done. I have my 7 themes. They're in this particular location. I can now feel comfortable stepping away because I've met the definition of what that outcome is, or what the expectations are. Then you're going to think about sequence. What's the order in which things should occur within an activity? And so that could be things like, when we're synthesizing, within 24 hours after a session, each individual is going to go in and tag key moments in Great Question in the research platform. 2 days after the last session, we're all going to come together and we're going to do affinity mapping and find those big themes, and we're going to prioritize them and we'll document them in the same session. So you laid out the sequence and the timing. So not only what's the order that things should happen, but when should they happen? When do they need to be completed? How long should each step take? And so by specifying those, again, you know what to expect. You're not spending too much time, or maybe not enough time, or doing things out of order, which might cause you to have to go back and rework things because they weren't in that sequence. And lastly, method, which is which tool or approach should be used. Like, how are we going to do this? And so it might be things like, we're going to use Great Questions tagging and highlights feature individually, and then we're going to come together and review that over Zoom on a shared screen to be able to do our affinity mapping and surface the top themes. And we're going to do a dot voting exercise in order to identify those that we want to surface in our report out. And we're going to use our standard template for documenting. So again, it's being very clear about what good looks like, about how we're going to do this, what we're going to use, when we're going to do it. Because when you create that structure, it's much easier to see the deviations. If you don't have that structure, you don't know, do I have a process problem? Or maybe the process is broken? Or do I have a compliance problem where maybe the process is really good, but people just aren't following the process? Well, you don't know that until you kind of apply this sort of structure so that you can see it.
I love this. And yeah, of course, like as you mentioned, like which tool or approach, one of the things I'm sure is coming to mind for everyone here is, incorporating AI tools into everyday activities. And sort of the question around like, and this is a big question, so I'm sure it'll need to be broken down a bit, but what are your thoughts on various AI tools and it's either amplifying waste or eliminating it? And how do you think about it in this way?
Yeah, you definitely hit on like exactly the right tension. It's really tempting to think that AI is a cure-all. AI is just going to make us faster. And AI absolutely has the potential to do some really cool things, but it also has the potential to amplify waste if we're not thoughtful about it. It's really easy to ask AI to do things. It's also really easy to ask AI to do things that don't actually need to be done. And so if we're doing that, it's just overproduction and over processing, but now at great scale because we're able to do so much more of it so quickly. And we have to remember AI is not free. I even saw a comment in here earlier of like, storage is free. Why should we care about, inventory carrying? But it turns out it's not really free. Like AI or storage, like it consumes resources. Whether that's a financial cost, our companies are having to pay for us to have credits for these various AI tools, or
Mhm.
whether it's actually just using resources, it's using compute power, it's using natural resources. And the more that we're doing that towards non-value added outputs, I mean, it's literally wasteful. But on the flip side, AI, because of how it works, particularly through like these chat interfaces, um, you can't automate something without defining it really clearly. And so it is giving us the opportunity to actually think about, well, what do I actually need? It gives you an opportunity to define what the outcome is, what the output that you're looking for AI to deliver. It's asking you like, what do I genuinely value? What do I want AI to do or not do? Maybe AI can do some things that save you time, like AI transcription means maybe you don't have to take manual notes. That could be a time saver. That could be, adding value to you and your processes because it's eliminating waste. And maybe AI can like enable analysis at scale. So you're doing things that you physically couldn't do before, or mentally, maybe not even wrapping your head around the scale or the quantity of the data. And so that's really exciting, but we want to make sure that we're being really um, thoughtful about how we approach this, very strategic in how we approach this, and only asking AI to do things that we think are ultimately going to add value to either us or our downstream customers.
And I think you're speaking to this a bit already, but like, concretely, how does lean thinking apply to, or like influence our interactions with AI?
Yeah. I've said this several times. I keep coming back to it because it is so core. Like lean thinking teaches us to deeply understand our customers and what they value and really focus on that. It's almost the epitome of being like customer centric. Um, but we have to think about that same approach with AI almost as if it is a customer of ours. It is intaking our instructions, it is intaking our
Mhm.
directions. And so we need to think about, well, what does AI need in order to do its job well? Well, it needs really clear instructions. It needs relevant context. It needs structured information. It needs, success criteria. What does good look like? What is the output? And so if you're giving it vague prompts or you haven't really thought through what you want and you're kind of just spitballing, it's kind of garbage in, garbage out. And so the more that you can be really aware of what AI needs almost as a consumer, you can better serve it. You can provide value so that it in turn can provide value to you. Which also begs the question of, so what do you value? What do you actually want the AI to produce? Do you want it to produce a full draft? Do you want it just to produce an outline? Do you want the top 5 themes? Do you want paragraphs? And so the more explicit you can be, the more likely you're going to be able to get the value that you want out of the AI tool, rather than just ending up with a lot of stuff that actually just forces you to wade through it, which in and of itself is creating a lot more like motion waste. So it's thinking about AI as the customer in this exchange, but also yourself as the customer of AI's output, and asking that question around value and waste in both directions.
I love that framing. I totally subscribe to that. That really resonates. And I know we're kind of getting towards the end here. But so let's just do like a last final statement from you around if someone listening today wants to start applying lean thinking to their research operations tomorrow, what's the thing they should do first? And then we'll get into the Q&A that we didn't get to in the session so far. But what's the thought you would leave us with?
The thought I would probably leave you with is kind of identify what bothers you in your work. Like, where are the frustration points? We heard about frictions, because frictions are often a red flag to say that there's waste present.
Mm,
And use that as maybe a place to say, there's a lot here. Our work is really big. How do we find something that's smaller and more manageable? Well, often that's finding the things in our own work that cause us the most pain or cause us frustration. And create a manageable space, a manageable scope to do that deep dive. Ask who the customers are, map the process, identify the sources of waste, ask the questions, does this add value? But do it in a way where you're not trying to boil the ocean. I think it's very easy to get overwhelmed by, oh, this is daunting. How are we going to overhaul our entire research operations? That shouldn't be the goal. The goal should be, how can I make this particular activity more valuable and
Mm.
less stressful, and then build on that. In lean thinking, there is this idea of continuous improvement, this idea of you're going to learn through experimentation, you're going to get better over time. The goal is not perfection, the goal is improvement. And I think if we can internalize that, it makes it much more manageable, to be able to start small, start relevant, start close to the things that we do, and then ultimately to build out and scale from there without trying to do everything all at once.
Love that. Kind of like the Kaizen method, right? Like the
Absolutely. Yeah.
start small, start measurable, and adjust and iterate. Yeah, that's great. There were a number of questions in the chat that came around research tooling. So I thought we'd just spend a little bit of time on that. So there's a question from Donald. In the digital world, the cost of inventory seems very low incrementally. So I wonder how you have succeeded or failed getting real additional investment to tools or platforms to reduce this waste.
That's a good question. A lot of times, if you're thinking about incremental investment, you want a new tool, you want something over and above what you already have. You need to justify it. What's going to be the
Mm.
return on the investment? And I think lean thinking gives you the vocabulary to talk about either that return is going to be increased value, we're able to do things that we couldn't do before, or it's going to be waste reduction. We're able to take time out of our process. We're able to take friction out of our process. We're able to take errors out of our process. And so, if you can measure, quantify, demonstrate, or more importantly, just articulate what is this additional tool going to be able to give us, or ultimately simplify for us. Because a lot of times in business, of course, they speak the language of return on investment. They want to know, what are they going to get for their money.
Yeah.
The other piece here is also, along with that request, is making suggestions of, so what can we take away? Because often, if you're bringing in a new tool, particularly if it's a tool that does more or can do more in one space, does that mean you can maybe pare back your licensing in a different tool, or maybe eliminate it from your tech stack entirely? And so thinking comprehensively of, like, how is this going to impact our work, and how would we demonstrate, quantify, or articulate that value, or that waste reduction, can often help make that case to be more compelling and hopefully more successful.
Something that the question to follow up with that, I think that really pairs well is when talking about is like getting funding for tools, or let's say you had a platform and it was taken away from you. So Maggie asked us in particular, how do you work on streamlining participant recruitment when the organization takes away a tool that was used to help with that?
Oh, that's often painful.
Yeah.
And kind of going back to, like, the return on the investment, often it's helpful to make that pain transparent.
Mhm.
A lot of us as researchers, I think this is a broad statement, but we like making our stakeholders happy. We like doing things for them. We're often in service to an organization, or in service to a project or a product. Um, so we sometimes will take that extra effort and kind of just take it on ourselves, versus making that pain, making that waste visible. And that's part of lean thinking, is like, by walking the process, by documenting it, by flagging where the waste is, you help not only yourself, but actually the whole organization to understand what that friction is and how much of an impact it's having. And so, rather than just stomaching and say, oh, we lost this tool, now our recruiting is going to be really difficult, but we're going to suck it up, I would actually argue the opposite of, like, rather than just sucking it up, how do you make it really visible to those people who maybe don't see the impact of that decision or the impact of that change? How do you surface to them in a way that they're going to understand, recognize, and appreciate the additional pain, the additional waste, or maybe the lack of value that has happened because of that tool transition?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great answer, I think. And Zyla, I think, I hope I'm not saying that horribly wrong, asked if you joined an organization with a repository that is currently unorganized and difficult to search, what would you prioritize or consider to avoid waste while working to organize the repository?
Oh, that's a great question. And actually, there's some great answers in here. So I don't necessarily want to duplicate some of the things that Lucas has said because I absolutely agree. Start with the things that are recent, start with the things that are high impact. Great suggestions. Um, Kind of goes back to that whole point, like don't boil the ocean. Start with the
Mm,
things that are closer. But I would also add in here, if you have a research operations team, I would work with them. Sometimes it's very tempting to like go off on our own and solve things, which may actually introduce more problems because now there's multiple ways that people are doing things. Um, if you have that research operations team, understand what have they done in the past? What problems was that maybe the current approach trying to solve? Are those problems still present, or maybe are we dealing with difficult or different issues, or maybe different value propositions? If you don't have a research operations team, though, the question might be, are there other like-minded individuals around me? Maybe it's a colleague, maybe it's a manager who I can enroll in this with me, who can go along this journey with me, both as a thought partner, but also as someone maybe with an extra set of eyes to see that waste, to see what's working and what's not working, but also to buy into that solution together, to try it out together, because
yeah,
ultimately it is through that experimentation. It's try something, see if it works, improve upon it, and like continuously improve. And so either of those approaches, could potentially help if you do come in and like it's really hard to search, like find something small, find those people who can, either help you understand why it is the way that it is, or be, thought partners and kind of teammates, collaborators as you try to, tackle it in small pieces and learn along the way.
love that. Great reminder not to take everything on by yourself and to leverage your team, learn from your team, and work together. Last question. I think we'll have time for this. So Laura asked, how do you measure whether a lean change is actually improving outcomes and not just speed?
So it comes back to being really customer focused and understanding what they value. Again, asking them what do they value, but be willing to follow up. Did the deliverable that I created for you actually help? Did this add value? Did this improve your decision making ability? Did it improve the quality of your outcome? And this isn't just like our product stakeholders, but this could be also the person who's next to us in a process, the one who is downstream from us, asking
Mhm.
them, is the way that I communicated this helpful to you? What could I be doing better? What could I be doing different? It's almost asking like a customer satisfaction survey, whether you do that formally or informally, but it's having the maybe the humility to ask, how am I doing? How am I delivering to you? Um, and are there things that I could be doing better? I'll give
Yeah.
one example from early on when I was in that quality organization. When I came back from that training, it was like, I have to do something different. I was realizing that even the way that I was asking my team for things was causing confusion. It was causing extra work. I might say,
Mhm.
hey, can one of you do these? And either no one would do it, leaves me in a position of not having the input that I needed, or two people would end up both doing it and they'd be doing redundant efforts. And so I became really clear about, I want this person to do it. This is what good looks like. This is when I want it. Here's how you could get that information back to me. And then once we'd done that, had the conversation of, how is this working for you? Are you getting what you need? Am I getting the output that I need? How can we collectively kind of work better together and drive that clarity, drive that, consistency in that structure that's going to help both of us be able to do better work. So coming back to kind of the measurement, like you ask people, like that's
Right.
the easiest way to do it.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Sarah, for sharing your insights on lean thinking, and how it applies to modern research operations, especially as we're all kind of grappling with how AI fits into our workflows. So you can find Sarah on LinkedIn, and her article on lean thinking and user research is available on the Great Question blog. So those links are all in the chat. Keep an eye out on in your inbox for the recording of the session coming soon. So thank you all so much for joining us today.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.